We just selected 200 villages to reach those who are vulnerable, 65 plus population. So we are concerned especially for those who are 65 plus and to ensure that they have vaccination coverage. But in the current circumstances, we need to assess, we need to ensure that there is a safe path of the healthcare workers to those households, those people, and these are the negotiations that need to take place at a very high level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Sosifal, Assistant Director General, Emergencies Response, please.
Thank you, Christian. To complement our representative, the impact of the conflict on COVID-19 is already very big because we have seen a huge decrease in terms of capacity to test. Last week only we have seen more than 80% reduction in the number of PCR tests performed in the country. And the other issue is the disruption of health services in terms of clinical management for COVID. We already talked about the oxygen supply, but the risk is to see very high case fatality rate, as we have seen in other conflict-affected countries like Yemen, where we have more than 18% case fatality rate. So making sure that we have the continuity of services, because the health workers also will leave the hospital when it's not safe. So it's very complex, and we are at risk of seeing people dying from condition we can really treat, and this is really, really bad. Thank you.
And Dr. Ryan, please.
And just to add, when we talk about, I think the estimate just last week was there was about 2,000 people on oxygen, high-flow oxygen for COVID in Ukraine. There's 2,000 people that need oxygen to survive, and that number, it hasn't changed. And in fact, if anything, that number has gone up because we have people with injuries, people undergoing surgery who need oxygen. We have children with childhood pneumonia. We have women in difficulties in labour. So oxygen is not just life-saving in COVID. Oxygen is life-saving, full stop. And you need it when you need it. You can't wait till tomorrow for oxygen. You can't wait till next week. You can't be put on a waiting list for oxygen. You can't stand in a queue for oxygen. Oxygen saves your life right now. And when you need it, you need it. And Ukraine needs that. That's just one example, as Sose has said, but it's a very clear example that if we do not get oxygen into the system and other critical drugs, people will die needlessly. They're dying needlessly to start with, but there's a secondary level of needlessness. And when you see the images, and we've all seen them here ourselves, and some of us have been in this game a long time, and we've developed very thick skins, but when you see nurses mechanically ventilating infants in basements of hospitals, even the toughest of us, we struggle to watch that. And those heroes who are there, those mainly women, might I add, in those basements who are taking care of those kids. But if you're a 65 or 70-year-old in an ICU, no one can carry you down the stairs to the basement. So many patients in adult ICUs cannot be moved. And they're being cared for by doctors and nurses while the bombs fall around them. It's really important that we don't just break this down into supplies and break this down into commodities that we have to deliver and corridors, and we speak in these very abstract terms around what's needed. People's bodies and people's bones are being broken, people's lives are being lost, and there isn't a health service available to be able to deliver life-saving care. And we can't supply that health service at the moment. So something has got to move and something's got to change to create the conditions in which that can happen. We need to be able to, as we've seen with insulin, again, you can't wait for your insulin. In fact, those planes that are arriving today and tomorrow have pretty good supplies of insulin on them. So that's one product that we definitely need to get into the country. So I do think we need to step back and also admire and really, I just could not believe the bravery of those frontline health workers, and they're a shining example to the world of what the health system should be doing everywhere.
Thank you so much for this. We move on to Priti Patnaik from the Geneva Health Files. Priti, please unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question. We know that the pandemic is far from over, but is the WHO under pressure to consider declaring the end of the pandemic sometime in 2022, particularly because COVID-19 vaccines production will reach a surplus soon. And this will inevitably have an impact on the discussions at the WTO around the TRIPS waiver. It will be good to know the circumstances under which the organization will declare an end to the pandemic. That will also have an impact on the contracts of pharmaceutical companies on pricing and patents and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priti, and we'll move to Dr. Maria van Kerkhoff, COVID lead.
Yes, thanks. So I'll start, and others I'm sure will come in. So I think we would like nothing more to say that this pandemic is over, but unfortunately we're not there yet. With the fact that we are still seeing incredibly intense transmission of Omicron worldwide, this variant has quickly replaced Delta in circulation and detection around the world. Many countries have passed their peak of transmission of Omicron, but many have not. And we have seen in a number of countries the amount of death that has been reported from Omicron has in fact been higher than it was in the Delta wave, in their Delta wave that they experienced. And this is because of the sheer volume of cases that we've seen from Omicron. And even though intrinsically it's less severe than Delta, the number of people that have required hospitalization and have died from Omicron has been higher in a number of countries. And this is due to a number of factors. One is because of the sheer volume and the burdening of the healthcare systems around the world that are fragile from past waves of infection. Second is because we have not reached the vaccination coverage levels that we've needed in all countries, and in particular, reaching those who are most vulnerable. In the countries that have seen higher amounts of death in the Omicron wave compared to Delta, we've actually seen that this is in fact in populations who are not vaccinated, who have not received the full course, people who are of older age, people with underlying conditions. And this, we've used this word avoidable a lot today. This is also avoidable. So reaching the vaccination coverage, the 70% that the Director General has outlined of reaching 70% of all populations in all countries, it's who within that 70% that is really critical. The SAGE recommendations have been very clear on who we need to target in all countries. These are people of older age, these are people of underlying conditions, these are our frontline workers. And in fact, we have not reached all of those individuals in all countries. So that is our target. That is who we are aiming to reach in all countries. And no matter what is happening out there in the rest of the world, we still need to push vaccination coverage as best we can, while at the same time doing everything that we can, recognizing the challenges that all countries are facing right now, and the fact that they're in different situations to also drive transmission down with the tools that we have. So it's both sides of that equation.
Thank you very much, Dr. van Kerkhoff. Dr. Bruzelba, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian. There are two parts to that question, of course, and I think the first one about the end of the pandemic, like Maria highlighted, this is not a function of vaccination coverage. It's what's happening with the epidemiology and the virology that drives this. And remember that the surge we are seeing now of Omicron is just the most recent surge of this virus. So it is going to be a function of time and the control measures that are going to tell us when we are approaching the end of the pandemic. Important point, as Maria says, is we have the knowledge, we have the tools to get there, only if we apply them everywhere. Vaccination rates become really important because the higher we can get the vaccination, the faster we're going to get there and drive this. But there was a second part of the question, and that was about the vaccine supply being secured. And I think we need to be clear here. We're in a situation right now where, yes, we do have a lot of vaccine, increasingly a lot of vaccine that is available. That vaccine is not in the arms of the people that need it everywhere, as Maria highlighted. And one of the appeals the Director General led 10 days ago was for the additional financing that's needed to make sure that the vaccines turn into vaccinations, that the tests turn into actual testing results, that the oxygen, et cetera, actually gets to the people that need it, and that requires another $16 billion. So there is also a price tag to getting us faster to the end of the pandemic. And the last point was just in terms of that supply. Well, we have supply. We still have that problem we started the pandemic with, and that is that the control of that supply is really in very few hands. And the only way that we're going to be able to ensure security globally in the future is exactly as you highlighted, and that is the more geographically and fairly distributed means of production as well, and we are not there yet. Important work's been done. You saw over the last few weeks some very important announcements about the new WHO mRNA hub in South Africa. There are many spokes now off of that hub, a huge effort to move it's a bit of a Manhattan Project in some regards, and moonshot to try and get additional capacity built out around the world as rapidly as possible to be able to manage that aspect as well.
Thank you, and Dr. Kayla O'Brien, please.
This is the target for achieving the goals related to vaccination and reducing transmission, but most importantly, reducing disease that is severe and death. And I'll give you an example that it's not 70% of just anybody in the population. It really is about those who are most in need of vaccination to protect them directly from disease. And we're still quite a distance from that. Just an example from the Africa region, with 23 countries where about 35% of the health workers have been fully vaccinated. Similarly, for those who are older adults, about 25% of older adults fully vaccinated, and similar numbers a little bit lower for those with underlying medical conditions. So the real emphasis in every country is about getting 100% coverage of those who are most needing the vaccine, 100% coverage of health workers, 100% coverage of older adults, 100% coverage of those who have underlying medical conditions, on the way towards a 70% coverage of the whole population. So this is really where the focus has to be. That's what will take the pressure off the health system, because that's what's really underlying the cases that are in hospital and the deaths that are occurring. Thanks.
Thank you very much, all. And next question goes to Abdullah Wassan from the Morocco News. Abdullah, please unmute yourself. Abdullah, you hear us? Please unmute yourself.
نعم.
Yes, please go ahead.
أشكركم على اختيار سؤالي هذا.
1 second, please. We need to switch to translation.
أود أن أطرح سؤالا حول مدى استعداد المنظمة العالمية للصحة من أجل توفير المساعدة الطبية للدولة المتضررة في حرب روسيا وأوكرانيا، ومدى تأهب المنظمة العالمية للصحة من أجل مكافحة الأوبئة التي سوف تنتج
integrity. Solomon Islands calls on all parties to settle international disputes by peaceful means. We welcome talks currently taking place between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. We call on all parties to listen more and better understand. We in the present must look to the past as we chart our way forward. We must never forget the United Nations was created under the auspices of a world war. My people of Solomon Islands have lived through what consequences a world war can bring. Never again must the world go through another. Never again must humankind suffer its brutal consequences. We are already inundated with global challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change and sea level rise. As a small, vulnerable state, Solomon Islands is deeply concerned that the situation in Ukraine is diverting much needed attention to a global development agenda as we continue to combat climate change, improve the quality of all people, and deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. Solomon Islands stand in solidarity with all who have lost loved ones and express great concern on the worsening humanitarian situation. We commend initiatives of neighboring states to protect the lives of the vulnerable population. We need each other more during this difficult period. Let us use the multilateral tools available to seek permanent peace, for the stakes are just too high if we fail. Solomon Islands will vote in support of this resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Solomon Islands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Myanmar.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, at the outset, we welcome the convening of this emergency special session. We thank you, Mr. President, and Mr. Secretary General in this regard. This emergency special session is timely, and it would allow all countries, small and big, to raise our voices on the serious situation Ukraine is facing and our concern in the state of affairs of this universal organ, the United Nations. Myanmar always adheres to and takes firm position on the territorial integrity, independence, and sovereignty of all countries. Therefore, Myanmar condemns the invasion of Ukraine and unprovoked attacks against the people of Ukraine. These acts are flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. Myanmar calls on to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have been following with great concern the situation on the ground in Ukraine. It is regrettable that the situation is further escalating with intensifying attacks of the Russian Federation. As a result, many people have been killed and hundreds of thousands of people left their home. The people are suffering even in the severe cold weather. We call on immediate cessation of hostilities and attacks on Ukraine. Myanmar understands and shares more than others the suffering that the people of Ukraine are encountering. The people of Myanmar are facing similar horrible suffering resulted from the inhumane acts, atrocities, crimes against humanity committed by the Myanmar military. Due to the military's excessive use of force and indiscriminate attacks on people, as well as their inhumane and brutal acts, many houses, religious facilities, healthcare facilities, schools, and farmland have been destroyed. And accordingly, hundreds of thousands of people have to leave their respective places and became displaced people in addition to number of people dead and injured. The displaced people and victims include people from vulnerable groups such as people with disability, elderly people, women, girls, and children. I wish to commend the neighboring countries of Ukraine, which opened their borders and extend warm reception of Ukrainians and other nationals who escaped from the terrifying attacks. We also thank all member states who support Ukraine in every possible way. I appeal them to continue to do so and do more. Mr. President, the UN Charter clearly begins with, I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," end quote. I wish to further recall that, quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institutions of method that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest," end quote. Excellencies, dear colleagues, it is time for all of us to stand with justice and stand with the principle of the UN Charter. Myanmar stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. In doing so, Myanmar co-sponsors the draft resolution and will vote yes. Justice, freedom, and peace must prevail all over the world. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Myanmar. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, Pakistan is committed to the fundamental principles of the UN Charter: self-determination of peoples, non-use or threat of use of force, sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and pacific settlement of disputes. Equally, Pakistan upholds the principle of equal and indivisible security for all. These principles must be consistently and universally respected. Mr. President, Pakistan remains deeply concerned at the recent turn of events. This reflects a failure of diplomacy. Prime Minister Imran Khan has regretted the latest situation between Russia and Ukraine and said that Pakistan hoped that diplomacy could avert military conflict. We have since repeatedly stressed the need for de-escalation, renewed negotiations, sustained dialogue, and continuous diplomacy. All efforts must be made to avoid further escalation of violence and loss of life, as well as military, political, and economic tensions, which can pose an unprecedented threat to international peace and security and global economic stability. as consistently underlined by Prime Minister Imran Khan, the developing countries are hit the hardest economically by conflict anywhere. We hope that the talks initiated between the representatives of the Russian Federation and Ukraine will succeed in bringing about a cessation of hostilities and normalization of the situation. A diplomatic solution in accordance with relevant multilateral agreements, international law, and the provisions of the UN Charter is indispensable. Pakistan also supports all efforts to provide humanitarian relief to civilians in the affected areas. The government of Pakistan is most concerned about the safety and welfare of Pakistani citizens and students in Ukraine. The majority of them have been evacuated. Those who remain will be evacuated soonest. We appreciate the cooperation of the Ukrainian authorities, as well as the Polish, Romanian, and Hungarian governments in this context. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Djibouti.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, at the outset, Djibouti welcomes the convening of this emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly to address an urgent matter, the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. It is a matter of deep regret that the Security Council failed to act in unison after the veto cast by Russia, thus effectively undermining the capacity of this vital organ to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. We often lament the inability of the Council to respond decisively to emerging crises. The refusal expressed by a majority of Member States to be paralyzed into inaction is a testament to the commitment of Member States to ensure that the UN remains relevant in the face of vexing and complex security challenges. Djibouti unequivocally condemns what is, in our view, constitutes an egregious breach of international law and the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, in particular the obligation of all states under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. If a country has legitimate security concerns, we urge that country to prioritize using tools as expressly contemplated by Article 33 of the Charter, which obligates parties to a dispute that is likely to endanger peace and security to seek its solution among other means, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or judicial settlement. We welcome the offer of good offices made by the Secretary General and reiterate the call by the African Union to establish an immediate ceasefire and to open political negotiations without delay under the auspices of the United Nations in order to preserve the world from the consequences of planetary conflict. No argument, no pretext can justify the use of force, the all-out war, and the brutal violence unleashed on Ukraine and its people. Mr. President, we are appalled by the continued attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We are heartsick to watch the gut-wrenching images of civilians fleeing the violence and seeking refuge in neighboring countries. We echo the call made by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the High Commissioner for Refugees for unimpeded humanitarian access so that aid is delivered to those in need. Ukrainians may have decided to valiantly defend their country and not surrender, but if the war does not stop now, they may not survive. As a distinguished Ukrainian representative powerfully stated, if Ukraine does not survive, international law will not survive. The aggression against Ukraine places under stress the system of international law and international relations that the Charter put into place. Let us not allow decades of efforts to strengthen the rule of law and revitalize multilateralism go down the drain. Djibouti will therefore vote yes to reaffirm its solidarity to the people of Ukraine. It will vote yes to uphold the UN Charter. It will vote yes to reject the use of armed force and any pretext in aggression against a sovereign country. It will vote yes in support to the sanctity of borders. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes rassurés par les mesures prises pour faire face aux actes de discrimination à l'égard d'Africains qui ont ému nos populations à travers le continent. Cependant, nous sommes alarmés par la persistance de représentations qui marquent du sceau du négatif l'Africain, ainsi que par le traitement médiatique de soi-disant experts qui opèrent une distinction entre les réfugiés fuyant les conflits au Moyen-Orient et les réfugiés fuyant la guerre en Ukraine. Les conflits sont les mêmes partout où ils se produisent et ils génèrent souvent les mêmes conséquences dévastatrices. Nous sommes à un moment crucial de l'histoire des Nations Unies. Nous devons mettre au conflit et tout mettre fin au conflit et tout mettre en œuvre afin de prévenir que de nouveau ne naisse. C'est à notre portée. Nous en avons les ressources. Mobilisons ensemble la volonté politique dans ce sens. Merci de votre attention.
To put an end to them. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Djibouti. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bhutan.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, we meet today in this August Assembly for the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly to address the alarming situation in Ukraine, a fellow member state of our United Nations. It is significant that owing to deadlock in the UN Security Council, this is the first time in 40 years that the provisions of the Uniting for Peace resolution are being invoked. Bhutan has closely observed with deep concern the rapidly escalating conflict on the ground. We join others in calling for the respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Perched atop the Himalayas, even the folds of our mighty mountains cannot shield us from the reverberations of events thousands of miles away. Today, core principles of the UN Charter and a rules-based international order are at stake, endangering international peace and security far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Europe. Mr. President, each and every one of us, big and small, rich and poor alike, have, on admission to the United Nations, ascribed to the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter. Bhutan made that solemn pledge over 50 years ago. These are principles all member states are beholden to, but for small states, they serve as the guarantor of our existence. Bhutan is a small and peace-loving country, firmly avowed to peaceful coexistence and good neighborly relations between states. Bhutan adds its voice to the chorus within this hall in defense of the UN Charter, in defense of the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. The threat or use of force and acts of aggression against another sovereign state can never be accepted. We cannot condone the unilateral redrawing of international borders. Bhutan will therefore support the resolution which is now before the Assembly, and in doing so, we reaffirm the call for the respect of international law and the core principles of the UN Charter. In closing, Mr. President, Bhutan expresses its regret at the reports of growing numbers of casualties and loss of innocent lives as a result of the crisis in Ukraine. Our hearts and prayers go out to the families of those who have lost their lives in the escalating conflict and the hundreds of thousands of others who have been displaced and suffer in its wake. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bhutan. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, as a peace-loving nation, the Lao PDR firmly upholds the principles of the United Nations Charter and its obligation under the international law. Towards this end, the Lao PDR has continued to pursue its consistent policy of peace, independence, friendship, and cooperation with all nations. As a country previously suffered from the scourge of war, the Lao PDR knows too well the endless negative consequences it will cause to the innocent lives. We believe what it's entailing is not of the interest to any party. The Lao PDR has been closely following the current developments in Ukraine, which is complex and fragile. We commend the UN and countries which have offered humanitarian assistance to the affected people. Mr. President, we remain skeptical of the unilateral sanction. On the contrary, we would also be mindful that the sanctions imposed could entail long-term impact on innocent people, including the global community at large, especially during the pandemic period. Therefore, we call on all parties concerned to refrain from any action that could further fuel the escalation of tension and seek peaceful solutions and restore peace and security. Towards this end, we support the ongoing effort to find a peaceful settlement to this situation through diplomatic means, including the recent peaceful negotiation held at the border of Belarus. It is important that legitimate security concerns of all parties be taken into account. Mr. President, we have heard at this emergency special session during the past 2 days divergent views and opinions. Nevertheless, one common call loudly echoed in this assembly hall is the call for peace, which can only be achieved through diplomatic means. It is our fervent hope that through this diplomatic effort, peace can be restored. Peace which constitutes the heart and soul of our organizations, United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lao People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Cambodia expressed its grave concern on the situation unfolding and human suffering, as well as for the loss of life in Ukraine. We strongly believe that a lasting peace can be achieved only through a peaceful dialogue and negotiation. All parties must ensure that all civilian and civilian infrastructure are protected. Access to humanitarian assistance to the people in and around Ukraine must be ensured during this difficult time. Cambodia fully supports the Secretary General's effort in addressing the humanitarian crisis and to find a peaceful solution in Ukraine. On 26 February, the ASEAN Foreign Minister released a statement urging the concerned parties to seek a peaceful resolution in accordance with international law, the principle of the UN Charters. Cambodia has its firm position that all member states must respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of other member states. With that, Cambodia has co-sponsored the draft resolution and will vote yes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, the situation in and around Ukraine is a source of extreme concern, which necessitates urgent actions to de-escalate and find peaceful solution in accordance with international law. Azerbaijan deeply regrets that the ongoing crisis continues to cause significant casualties, in particular among civilian population. We express our deep condolences to the families of those perished and wounded. We call for strict adherence to international humanitarian law. Civilian lives and civilian infrastructures must be protected and safeguarded at all times. The evolving humanitarian crisis on the ground requires expedient measures to alleviate the impact of current situation on civilians. Proceeding from this understanding, Azerbaijan has already rendered, on a bilateral basis, humanitarian assistance of medicine and medical equipment and other first-need essentials to the people of Ukraine. This situation needs to be settled through peaceful diplomatic means in full compliance with the norms and principles of international law, guiding interstate relations, including respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of borders. Strict compliance with the norms and principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, and the fulfillment in good faith of the obligations assumed by states are of the greatest importance for the maintenance of international and regional peace and security. Azerbaijan reiterates its call for dialogue without delay to prevent the situation from the further escalation and underlining the necessity of direct negotiations between the parties. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Уважаемый господин председатель,
President,
уважаемый господин генеральный секретарь,
Secretary General,
Республика
the Republic
Беларусь
of
проголосует
Belarus will
против
vote
данного
against
проекта
this draft
резолюции.
resolution.
Мы все
We all
несем
bear
свою
our
долю
share of
ответственности
responsibility
за то,
for
что
what is
происходит
currently
сейчас на
happening
Украине.
in Ukraine.
8 лет
8
назад
years ago,
были подписаны
the
Минские
Minsk
соглашения.
agreements were signed.
Совет
The
Безопасности
Security
принял
Council
соответствующую
adopted
резолюцию.
a resolution on this.
Ни Совет
Not
Безопасности,
the
ни
Security
Генеральная
Council, nor the
Ассамблея,
General Assembly,
ни
nor the
международное
international
сообщество в
community
целом
as a
не
whole
смогли
were able
убедить
to
или
convince or
заставить
urge the
украинские
Ukrainian
власти
authorities to
выполнять
fulfill
положения
the
этих
provisions
документов.
of these documents. Все эти 8
Over the
лет
last 8
Украина
years,
фактически
Ukraine
находилась в
has
состоянии
essentially
гражданской
found
войны,
itself in a state of civil
поскольку
war.
киевские
In as
власти
much as
не
the Kyiv
желали
authorities did
садиться
not
за
wish
стол
to sit
переговоров
at the negotiation table
со своими
with their
согражданами из
compatriots
Донецка
from
и
Donetsk
Луганска
and Lugansk,
и
and they
отказывались
refused to take
учитывать
into
их
account their
законные интересы.
legitimate interests.
Все эти 8 лет
Over these last 8 years,
в Донецкой и
in
Луганской
the
народных
Donetsk and
республиках
Lugansk people's
гибли люди,
republics, people
в
have been
основном
dying,
гражданское население,
mainly
старики,
civilians, the
женщины,
elderly,
дети.
women and children.
Оперативный
Operative
параграф
paragraph
8
8 of the
внесенной
draft
резолюции,
resolution
проекта
before us,
резолюции, лицемерно
hypocritically
призывает все
calls on
стороны
all parties
выполнять
to
Минские
fulfill the
соглашения.
Minsk agreements.
Очень хочется
So
спросить
there is a question
авторов
then
и
to the
соавторов
sponsors and the co-sponsors
этого
of
проекта.
this draft resolution.
Где вы были все,
Where were you all,
господа?
ladies and gentlemen?
Почему вы за эти
Why,
8
over
лет
these 8
так и не
years,
смогли
have you
заставить
not been able
Киев
to urge Kyiv
выполнить
to fulfill
положения
the
этих
provisions of
документов?
these documents?
Под бесцеремонным давлением со стороны
The
США,
United
Канады,
States,
стран
Canada, and
Евросоюза,
the EU,
которые,
who,
естественно,
of
считают
course,
себя
believe themselves to be
эталоном
the gold
демократии,
standard of democracy,
оказались
have
и
exerted
ООН, и
cavalier
ОБСЕ,
pressure on the
и Совет
UN, the
Европы,
OSCE,
и
the
вообще
Council
все
of Europe,
международное
and on the whole
сообщество,
international community,
которые так и
they
не нашли
could
в
not
себе
find the
сил и
strength or
мужества
courage in
отреагировать,
themselves to
адекватно
respond,
отреагировать
adequately
на
respond
преступные действия
to the
украинских
criminal
властей.
activities of the Ukrainian authorities.
Нас спрашивают,
They ask us,
зачем вы вообще
why are you
вспоминаете
recalling
события
the events
прошлого
of the past
сейчас,
now,
когда в ходе вооруженного
when, during an
конфликта
armed
гибнут
conflict,
люди?
people are dying?
А наш ответ на самом деле
But
очень
actually,
прост.
our response is a very
Мы
simple
так
one.
и не извлекли
Let's look at the
надлежащих, правильных уроков
real
из событий
lessons
Второй
from the
мировой войны.
events of the Second World War.
Международное
The international
сообщество
community
так и не
then
осознало,
didn't
что любые ростки
realize then
неонацизма
that any
в
spark
любой
of
стране
neo-Nazism in any
должны быть
country needs
немедленно
to be
уничтожены.
swiftly extinguished.
То, что происходит
What is
сегодня в
happening
этом
today
зале
in this
и за
room
его
and
пределами
beyond
является
is
очередной яркой
another clear
демонстрацией,
demonstration
очередным
of
ярким
double
подтверждением
standards
двойных стандартов со
and a
стороны
confirmation of these double standards
США
on
и
the
их
side of
союзников,
the USA and
жертвами
their
преступлений
allies,
которых уже
whose
стали
crimes
сотни
have
тысяч
already
людей
led to
в
hundreds of
Югославии,
thousands of
Ираке,
victims in Yugoslavia,
Ливии,
in Iraq, Libya,
Афганистане.
and Afghanistan.
Мы категорически
We
отвергаем обвинения
categorically
в адрес
reject
Беларуси
accusations
в
against Belarus that
вовлеченности
we are
в
involved
незаконное
in
использование
unlawful
силы
use
против
of
Беларуси.
force against
Я
Ukraine.
вам открою
I will
страшную
let you in
тайну.
on a secret.
Мы действительно
Yes, we
вовлечены.
are involved.
Президент
The
Республики
President
Беларусь
of
Александр
Belarus,
Лукашенко
Alexander
лично
Lukashenko,
предпринял
personally is
максимальные
sparing no
усилия
efforts
для
to
того, чтобы обеспечить
ensure
контакты
contacts
между российской и
between the Russian and
украинской
Ukrainian
сторонами.
sides.
Наша
Our
вовлеченность
involvement
сегодня
today,
таким образом
thus,
заключается
goes as far as
в организации
organizing
переговоров
negotiations
между Российской
between the
Федерацией
Russian
и
Federation
Украиной
and Ukraine
и в обеспечении
and
всего
ensuring and doing
необходимого
everything we can to
для их
ensure that they
проведения.
are held.
И мы искренне
We
желаем
sincerely wish
успехов
every success
участникам
to the
переговоров.
participants in the negotiations.
Многие страны в
Many
своих
countries in their
выступлениях ни
statements
слова не
have
сказали
not
об
said
этих
a single
переговорах.
word about these negotiations.
Мы
We
понимаем, что они
understand that they
никогда не
never, for
произнесут
instance, they
название
never
нашей страны
utter
в
the name of our
положительном или
country
хотя
in
бы
a
в
positive
нейтральном
or even in a
ключе.
neutral tone.
Хочется спросить
We'd like to ask also
этих людей,
those
вас
people,
всех,
you, all of you,
вы просто не
do you
хотите
simply not
упоминать
want to
Беларусь
mention Belarus,
или вы не
or do you not
желаете
wish
успеха
these
этим переговорам?
negotiations to be successful?
В качестве реакции на
reaction to the
события
events in
на
Ukraine,
Украине некоторые страны
some
привычно
countries
схватились
reached
за
instinctively
свой
for their
излюбленный
favorite
инструмент
instrument,
санкций.
sanctions.
Мы хотим вас
We would like
предупредить,
to
именно вы
caution you, it will be
будете
you who will be
нести
responsible,
всю ответственность за
fully
то, что
responsible for
применение санкций в
how
отношении,
the
например,
imposition of
белорусских
sanctions, for
калийных
example, against
удобрений,
Belarusian potassium
приведет к
fertilizers
обострению
will lead to a
экономических и
worsening
социальных
economic
проблем
and
и росту
worsening
голода
economic
и в
and
ваших
social
собственных
problems and a
странах, и
growth
в странах,
in
которые
hunger
находятся
in
за
your
тысячи
own countries
километров
and in countries
от
located
Беларуси.
hundreds of kilometers from Belarus.
Объявленные санкции
The
уже не
sanctions announced
являются
are
точечными.
not
Они направлены на удушение экономики и ухудшение уровня жизни людей. Применяемые сегодня санкции, некоторые договорились до того, что объявляется экономическая война. Это худшее проявление экономического и финансового терроризма. Представители некоторых государств рапортуют о полной открытости их границ для выезда из Украины украинцев и иностранцев, граждан третьих стран. На этой якобы открытой границе, сообщаю вам, граждане Беларуси и России, в частности, все мужчины старше 18 лет, сталкиваются с огромными проблемами при попытках выезда из Украины. Украинские власти не выпускают их из страны, и россияне и белорусы фактически удерживаются в качестве заложников. Известны также случаи проявления расизма и дискриминации, избиения и выкидывания через границу иностранных граждан польскими пограничниками. 26 февраля польские пограничники избили и выдворили обратно на Украину группу из примерно 100 индийских студентов, которые в последующем были благополучно размещены в лагере для беженцев в Румынии. К нам в Минске, в Беларуси, поступают многочисленные обращения как от граждан Беларуси, так и от посольств тех стран, ваших стран, граждане которых хотели бы выехать в Беларусь для возвращения домой. С нашей стороны граница открыта. Мы готовы принимать как белорусов, так и рассматривать обращения о въезде граждан третьих стран. Мы призываем украинскую сторону отозваться на наши призывы и открыть гуманитарные коридоры или хотя бы один гуманитарный коридор для выезда в Беларусь через белорусско-украинскую границу. Мы уже официально обратились с этой просьбой, настоятельной просьбой, в представительство ООН и Международного комитета Красного Креста в Минске. Вызывает серьезное беспокойство разгул издевательств и мародерства, в том числе в отношении иностранцев на Украине. Бесконтрольная раздача оружия уже привела к резкому всплеску насилия и грабежей. Жертвами становятся обычные люди. Например, водители-дальнобойщики, которые осуществляют международные перевозки грузов. Среди них уже есть погибшие. Почему вы все замалчиваете эти факты? Кстати, насколько нам известно, на уровне руководства Африканского Союза были уже сделаны соответствующие заявления. Беларусь потеряла треть населения во Второй мировой войне. Мы хорошо знаем цену человеческой жизни. Мы скорбим по всем погибшим за последние 8 лет в Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках, в Киеве. Мы скорбим по людям, которые были заживо сожжены в Одессе. Мы скорбим по всем, кто погибает сегодня. Только переговоры могут остановить кровопролитие. Беларусь уже сделала многое и продолжает делать все возможное для урегулирования конфликта. В любой войне у каждой стороны есть своя правда. Любая война имеет собственную динамику, и по мере ее продолжения становится все более ожесточенной, что мы сегодня и наблюдаем. Мы все буквально тонем в море, в потоке лжи и дезинформации, которые распространяются информационными террористами. По-другому я этих людей назвать не могу. Абсолютное большинство из которых при этом сидит в удобных креслах, в теплых кабинетах за тысячи километров от зоны боевых действий. Через несколько минут мы все приступим к голосованию по внесенному проекту резолюции. Этот проект на самом деле должен состоять из одного параграфа, написанного не на ООНовском языке, а на нормальном человеческом языке. Он должен содержать призыв к немедленному прекращению военных действий и проведению переговоров. Я понимаю, что у каждого из вас есть инструкции из столиц. Я также знаю, что некоторых из вас очень настойчиво просили проголосовать за этот проект. И я не имею никаких иллюзий по поводу того, какими будут результаты нашего голосования. И все-таки я прошу вас еще раз подумать и проголосовать по совести, хотя я понимаю, что за голосование по совести в ООН можно потерять работу. Благодарю вас за внимание.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow delegates, to all those who dedicate themselves to the noble mission of this institution. Today, we call on Russia to stop its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We call on Russia to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We call on another neighbor of Ukraine, Belarus, who you've just heard from, to stop supporting the war and stop allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. And today, we stand together in holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law and to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes. This is an extraordinary moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Security Council has convened an emergency special session of the General Assembly. 40 years. Most of the men and women fighting in Ukraine were not even born the last time the United Nations came together in this way to unite for peace. And I would venture that many of the people in this room were not born when that happened. But a few of the eldest Ukrainians and Russians might recall a moment like this, a moment when one aggressive European nation invaded another without provocation to claim the territory of its neighbor. A moment when a European dictator declared he would return his empire to its former glory. An invasion that caused a war so horrific that it spurred this organization into existence. Now, at more than any other point in recent history, the United Nations is being challenged. If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war. It is to condemn war, to stop war. That is our job here today. It is the job you were sent here to do, not just by your capitals, but by all of humanity. A lot has happened very quickly to bring us to this unique moment. It was barely a week ago when, in the dead of night, President Putin launched a full-scale invasion of our fellow UN member state. At the very moment the Security Council was holding an urgent meeting attempting to foster diplomacy and de-escalation. As the Security Council discussed peace, Putin declared war. Ukraine has defended itself with great courage and vigor. As President Biden said in his State of the Union address last night, President Putin, and I quote, met a wall of strength he never imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. But the brazen and indiscriminate nature of Russia's attack has had devastating, horrific consequences for the entire country. Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings. It has bombed sacred burial grounds. It has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. Russia has spurred mass hunger and caused so many to flee their homes. The latest UN estimate are marching toward 1 million people. We thank the countries who have opened their borders, who have opened their hearts, opened their homes to those fleeing Ukraine. And I want to echo the UN Refugee Agency's call to help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees. For those who remain, Russia is destroying critical infrastructure, vital services which provide millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water to stay alive, gas to keep people from freezing to death. And now it appears Russia is preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign against Ukraine. We've seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, which are banned under the Geneva Convention. We all have seen the 40-mile-long lethal convoy charging toward Kyiv. President Putin continues to escalate, putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening to invade Finland and Sweden. At every step of the war, Russia has betrayed the United Nations. Russia's actions go against everything this body stands for. People across the world have already united together in exactly the way this General Assembly must do today. Protests and vigils against Russia's war and in solidarity with Ukraine, marked with blue and yellow, have sprung up across the globe. These are protests for peace. From Bangkok to Budapest, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from Sydney to Seoul, from Calgary to Cape Town, and even in Moscow and Minsk. People everywhere are standing up to call for President Putin to stop this attack. The Russian people are themselves asking how many lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. And they are appalled at the answer. To the Russian protesters, I say thank you. Thank you for your bravery. To the Russian soldiers sent to the front lines of an unjust, unnecessary war, I say your leaders are lying to you. Do not commit war crimes. Do everything you can to put down your weapons and leave Ukraine. The truth is that this war was one man's choice and one man alone, President Putin. It was his choice to force hundreds of thousands of people to stuff their lives into backpacks and flee the country, to send newborn babies into makeshift bomb shelters, to make children with cancer huddle in hospital basements, interrupting their treatment, essentially sentencing them to death. Those were President Putin's choices. Now it's time for us to make ours. The United States is choosing to stand with the Ukrainian people. We are choosing, in coordination with our allies and partners, to impose severe consequences on Russia. We are choosing to hold Russia accountable for its actions, and we will soon turn to vote on a resolution that does just that. We believe this is a simple vote. Vote yes if you believe UN member states, including your own, have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Vote yes if you believe Russia should be held to account for its actions. Vote yes if you believe in upholding the UN Charter and everything this institution stands for. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Observer State of the Holy See.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, thank you for calling this emergency special session, as in recent days we have been shaken by something tragic, war. The Holy See joins the many member states and millions across the globe who call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and the return to diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, the organization is founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It is the duty of all states to seek to resolve disputes through negotiation, mediation, or by other peaceful means, even when war has commenced. Mr. President, last Sunday, Pope Francis expressed his closeness with all who now suffer as a result of the conflict, stressing that, and I quote, "It is urgent to open humanitarian corridors, and those fleeing must be welcomed. With heart broken by what is happening in Ukraine, and let us not forget the wars in other parts of the world, I repeat, put down your weapons. Those who love peace reject war as an instrument of aggression against the freedom of other peoples and as a means for the settlement of international disputes." End of quote. The Holy See wishes to express, also in this forum, its appreciation to those states which are offering humanitarian assistance to those in need, both in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, in which many Ukrainians have sought safety. Mr. President, Pope Francis has called on believers and non-believers alike to observe this Wednesday, 2nd of March, as a day to be close to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, to feel that we are all brothers and sisters, and to implore of God the end of this war. The Holy See is convinced that there is always time for goodwill. There is still room for negotiations. There is still a place for the exercise of a wisdom that can prevent the predominance of partisan interest, safeguard the legitimate aspiration of everyone, and spare the world from the folly and horrors of war. May this emergency special session advance efforts that help attain this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished representatives, the Sovereign Order of Malta, a sovereign entity which provides global humanitarian aid with a special mission to serving the sick and the poor, has observed with great sadness and regret the ongoing conflict which has impacted the lives of so many citizens of Ukraine. and which is currently created an unprecedented flow of refugees seeking peace and security across their nation's borders. In 8 years of conflict, the Order's embassy to Ukraine has provided considerable support, advice, and material help to Ukrainian citizens and to non-Ukrainian residents of the country who are in need. The current crisis is seeing multiple cities and towns attacked and bombed, forcing families to leave their homes and seeking shelter elsewhere. Our representatives and ambassadors in the region report that while refugees have sufficient means to travel and find refuge on their own, or enjoy dual citizenship with nearby nations, the majority do not have the resources to provide for themselves without support. UN agencies predict that a potential refugee exodus of over 6 million persons might well be the outcome of this situation. In the meanwhile, many elderly people and those who are sick or disabled in some way are unable to escape the bombing and the stress that accompanies civil unrest. Our concern, obviously, is for them as much as it is for those who have managed to leave. Our staff and volunteers in major population centers within Ukraine continue to provide assistance as much as is feasible, given the ongoing security and safety problems. This past weekend, we held a summit of our regional ambassadors and aid providers under the auspices of our international relief agency, Malteser International. At that time, we were able to review both the growing extent of the refugee crisis as well as the initiatives we are taking to support the growing swell of primarily mothers and children and a small number of senior citizens. As of this morning, it is estimated that almost 700,000 individuals have made the journey across the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Moldavia. And each day that the conflict continues, the flow of anguished families will grow. We have seen some nations go out of their way to welcome these individuals and to help them through the trauma. Our Order of Malta staff along the border with Ukraine totals over 5,000 personnel, with tens of thousands of volunteers doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for the victims of injury and accident, providing counseling and emotional support, and assisting in securing of short-term accommodation. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing churches and community groups, have driven their cars and vans to provide transportation to new arrivals to ensure that they are given every opportunity to find a place to stay. We are coordinating our activities with international aid agencies, such as the Red Cross and the UNHCR, and are engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available for the support and maintenance of those in need. We are encouraged that the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva will be holding a debate on human rights in Ukraine today. Representatives from our government will be participating in this important discussion. We appeal to nations of goodwill to appreciate the trauma experienced by all refugees. In particular, we appeal to countries who are receiving refugees to extend the same welcome they're offering Ukrainians, to those of other national and ethnic groups who have been caught in this conflict and who are seeking security. The offer of help and support must cross ethnic, racial, and cultural lines and not be tainted by discriminatory acts or attitudes. This conflict in Europe drives home the realization that the issues of internally displaced persons and the needs of refugees forced from their homes affects the whole world: Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and now Europe. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, International IDEA strongly condemns the unprovoked war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation with the involvement of Belarus against Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy. This is in breach of international law and international agreements and a rules-based international order that underpins the shared objective of global peace and the existence of organizations such as International IDEA. The invasion order by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. As firm believers in the rights of peoples to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, we convey our full support to and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They are innocent victims of this aggression. We salute the brave partners and democracy activists with whom International IDEA has engaged in recent years when Ukraine made huge progress towards being a stable and thriving democracy. We call on the international community to spring into action to protect them and mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the invasion. We cannot fail to note that the military operation was launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to discuss the crisis. We reiterate our firm belief that international crises should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the Charter. It is particularly unfortunate that this naked rejection of these principles happens during a pandemic that has rendered evident the need for increased global cooperation to make the world governable and to achieve justice for all. In these days, we are witnessing what an unchecked ruler, for decades trampling fundamental rights and freedoms of his own citizens, can do to undermine peace and democracy beyond his own borders. Ukraine is a country that has successfully reached democratic standards over the past 2 decades, from respecting media freedoms to free and fair elections, local democracy, and the fight against corruption. It is no wonder President Putin is scared of such democratic vibrancy at his doorstep. This is a pivotal moment for Democrats all over the world to stand united in support of Ukraine. It is also the moment to reinforce action to counter and to prevent the rise of authoritarian regimes elsewhere, which cannot survive without kleptocracy and the systematic violation of human rights and freedoms. We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its military forces and fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Revanchist interpretations of history and attempts to change borders based on ethno-nationalist fantasies offer not a luminous path for humanity, but a route towards darkness and endless cycles of violence. They certainly don't provide any hope to the younger and unborn generations that will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, or to the billions of vulnerable people around the world that are yet to realize the promise of a life free from fear and want, and the promise of the Agenda 2030. Those are the real challenges of our age. We encourage the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to make use of his good offices to advance ceasefire talks, humanitarian access to the war-affected areas, and protection of civilians, and particularly the most vulnerable ones. We urge UN member states to adopt and enforce sanctions against the Russian Federation until withdrawal of their forces from Ukraine and the full restoration of its territorial integrity. We urge UN member states to do whatever it takes in compliance with the principles of the UN Charter to stop this war and prevent any further escalation of conflict. International IDEA will do its part in collaboration with the United Nations, our member states, and other democratic governments and organizations to protect in Ukraine and elsewhere the principle that every country has a right to freely determine its own fate on the basis of the will of the people, freely expressed. Democracy's institutions and processes are the best means to protect their right. Today, we must stand up for these principles. Today, we must stand up for Ukraine, which embodies these principles and defends them to our greatest respect. Dyakuyu, thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of the consideration of Agenda Item 5. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5 entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations addressed to the President of the Security Council S/2014/136 to take action on a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L1. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L1.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates. We are living through a defining moment for our generation. Our generation is the generation that was supposed by our predecessors to be saved from scourge of war. That is why our predecessors created the United Nations. And yet today, it falls to us to save future generations. Let me read the following text. Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is an illegal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the nation faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country. But aggressive warfare was outlawed. The defendants did make aggressive war a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we accuse or propose to inquire. End of quote. Said in his opening statement to the International Military Tribunal on November 21, 1945, in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, Chief of Counsel. And these words are addressed today to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Volodin, Ms. Matvienko, and perhaps dozens more, but certainly they are not addressed to the Russian citizens, those Russian citizens who try to preserve their dignity. For almost a week, Ukraine is fighting under the bombs and missiles, fighting in the face of armadas of hardware and countless crowds of enemies. They have come to the Ukrainian soil not only to kill some of us, not only to shift our course and priorities. They have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist. They have come to resolve has become a victim of this shelling by the Russian armed forces in Kharkiv. We offer our deepest sympathies to India and the relatives of the victim. A Chinese citizen was also injured in another Ukrainian city because of Russia's deadly attacks. The Ukrainian and foreign citizens have become hostages of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. In Kyiv, Russian murderers hit the city TV tower, killing 5 passerbys. One of the missiles dropped on the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, a sacred place of commemoration of Jews, Ukrainians, Roma, and representatives of other ethnic groups killed by Nazis during the World War II. What an irony when victims of Nazis are being killed for the second time by Nazi modern followers. As the President of Ukraine asked, what was the point of repeating the slogan, never again in 80 years? It's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation only. It is genocide. On 7th and 8th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice will hold public hearings in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. Also, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has decided to proceed with opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider observing the bloodshed in Ukraine that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, and after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He will celebrate his 100th
102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferenc. Benjamin Ferenc was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words, and I want you to listen very carefully.
Hard to do. 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it and the principles which have guided me. There are 3 principles. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
President,
господин генеральный секретарь,
Secretary
уважаемые
General,
коллеги,
colleagues,
Россия
Russia
просит
would
поставить
ask for
проект резолюции
this
на
draft
голосование.
resolution to be put to the vote.
Призываем
And we
вас
call
не
on you
поддерживать этот
not to
проект.
support this draft.
Однако мы знаем
However, we
о
know
беспрецедентном
about the
давлении,
unprecedented
которое
pressure
наши западные
that our
партнеры
Western
оказывали
partners
на
are
огромное
exerting
количество
on a
стран,
large number of countries,
заставляя их
urging
проголосовать
them to
так,
vote
как это угодно им.
as they see fit.
Это нельзя назвать
This
даже
is not
давлением.
something even that we can call pressure.
Это были открытые
It was
циничные угрозы.
open and
Нам
cynical
об этом
threats,
известно.
and we know about it.
Этот документ не
This
будет
document will
способствовать
not
прекращению
allow us
военных
to
действий.
end military activities.
Наоборот, он
On
может
the
одобрить
contrary, it could
киевских,
embolden
ободрить киевских радикалов
and
и националистов
Kyiv
и
radicals
дальше
and
любой ценой
nationalists to
определять политику
continue
в
to
стране,
determine the policy of their
удерживая в
country at any
заложниках мирное население.
price, holding peaceful civilians
Причем
hostage,
не в
but not
переносном, а в
in the
прямом смысле
figurative
этого слова.
sense of the term, but in the literal
Сейчас
sense
именно
of it.
так и
Now,
происходит
that
в
is what
ряде
is
крупных
happening
городов
in a series
Украины,
of cities in
где
Ukraine
население
where
используется в
people are
качестве
being
живого
used
щита.
as human shields.
Сегодня стало известно,
Today we've
что
learned
вооруженные
that
силы
in
Украины
the
не дают
Ukrainian
мирным
military are
жителям
not
Мариуполя
giving
покинуть город,
allowing citizens of Mariupol to leave the city.
удерживают их,
They are
в том числе женщин и
They
детей,
are keeping them
в
there,
одной из
including
школ
women
Мариуполя.
and
children there in one of the schools in Mariupol.
Насильно доставляет обратно всех гражданских лиц, которые пытались покинуть город по предоставленным гуманитарным коридорам. Нам также известно и о планируемых националистическими батальонами провокациях, которые они заготовили с участием гражданского населения с тем, чтобы впоследствии обвинить в этом российские войска. Вопреки нормам международного гуманитарного права, в жилых кварталах размещается военная техника, системы залпового огня, артиллерийские установки. Мы сегодня передадим примеры подобных действий руководству ООН, которое до настоящего момента утверждало, что не располагает подобными свидетельствами. Хотя видеоролики, снятые простыми украинскими гражданами, свободно распространяются в интернете. Ответственность за это полностью лежит на украинских властях, так же, как и за безответственную и преступную раздачу оружия всем желающим, включая выпущенных из тюрем заключенных. Это уже привело к массовым случаям грабежей, убийств и мародерства. Уважаемые коллеги, ваш отказ поддержать проект сегодня стал бы голосованием в пользу мирной Украины, свободной от радикализма и неонацизма, живущей в мире со своими соседями и отказавшейся от внешнего управления. Именно на достижение этих целей направлена наша специальная военная операция, которую авторы резолюции пытаются представить в качестве агрессии. Мы сегодня слышали от украинского представителя слова о нацизме, но он стыдливо умолчал о разгуле неонацизма на самой Украине, о бесчинствах неонацистских и националистических радикальных организаций, о факельных шествиях и прославлении пособников Гитлера. Те, кто интересовался развитием украинского кризиса, прекрасно понимают его генезис. Действуя сегодня, мы прежде всего стремимся остановить восьмилетнюю войну майданного режима с населением Донбасса. За прошедшие годы наша страна сделала все возможное и невозможное, чтобы избежать такого сценария. Мы, по выражению генерального секретаря, кстати говоря, перевернули все камни и постучались в каждую дверь, однако так и не были услышаны. Жители Донбасса продолжали и продолжают бомбить, не собираясь останавливаться на 14 тысячах погибших, подавляющее большинство из которых приходится на жителей ДНР и ЛНР. Цели нашей специальной операции, объявленные на основании статьи 51 Устава ООН, выполняются и будут достигнуты. При этом мы не наносим ударов по гражданским объектам и мирным жителям. Не верьте огромному количеству фейков, распространяемых в интернете на этот счет. Эти фейки пеклись, как пирожки, в Центре информационно-психологических операций специальных сил операции Украины. Этот центр вчера был уничтожен. Мирный сценарий для Украины можно ускорить, если радикалы позаботятся о сохранности жизни граждан своей страны и не будут прикрываться им. Такого призыва в тексте поставленного на голосование документа нет. В нем также ничего не сказано о незаконном перевороте в Киеве, когда в феврале 2014 года при попустительстве Германии, Франции и Польши и при поддержке Соединенных Штатов был свергнут законно избранный президент страны. В этом проекте нет ничего и о том, что новые националистические власти тотчас же ограничили права граждан на использование русского языка. Это дало старт огромной цепочке нарушений базовых прав жителей Востока страны, и не только Востока, включая самое ценное право на жизнь. Многие из вас не хотят ничего слышать о трагедии, которая началась на Украине после Майданного переворота 2014 года, о заживо сожженных людях в Одессе, о преследованиях и убийствах несогласных, и самым ярким проявлением этого стала развязанная Киевом война против Донбасса. Ничего в документе нет и о том, что на протяжении 8 лет Соединенные Штаты и Европа накачивали и сейчас накачивают Украину вооружением, помогая майданному режиму убивать мирных жителей на Донбассе. Оправдывали лояльные киевские власти за полное игнорирование минских договоренностей и саботаж резолюции Совета Безопасности 2202. Наконец, этот проект — это очевидные попытки тех, кто за последние десятилетия совершил бесчисленное количество агрессий, незаконных с точки зрения международного права военных операций, переворотов, одним из которых стал и майданный переворот на Украине, выставить себя поборниками международной законности. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and final Act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation state in resolution, will vote in favor of resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kinds of humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today clearly represents a prejudiced attitude based on political propaganda. It's a means of political pressure. Those who prepared the draft resolution incorporated an aggressive language against the Russian Federation to belittle its legitimate stand based on its security concerns and its right to protect its people from the threats to national Russian security. Belarus is also impacted
إن مشروع
by this
القرار
draft
هذا
resolution. This draft resolution
يمثل نفاقا سياسيا مفضوحا.
represents a flagrant
فلو كانت
political
الولايات المتحدة
hypocrisy.
الأمريكية وحلفائها الغربيين
Had the
جادون فعلا
US
في
and
نزع
its
فتيل التوتر في
Western
تلك
allies
المنطقة
been serious in
لكانوا قد أوفوا
de-escalating the
بالوعود التي
situation,
قطعوها للاتحاد الروسي
they
قبل
would
3
have
عقود
fulfilled the
بعدم
promises
توسيع نطاق
they
حلف الناتو
undertook
شرقا
3 decades ago, not
وتحويل
to
أوكرانيا
expand
إلى
EU
مصدر تهديد
and
مباشر وحقيقي للاتحاد
transform
الروسي.
Ukraine into a
ولكانوا
continuous
قد ضغطوا
threat
على
to
سلطات
the
كييف للالتزام باتفاقيات
Russian Federation, and they should have
ووقف
pressured
الانتهاكات الجسيمة
Ukraine
بحق
to
المدنيين
abide
في
by
دونباس.
Minsk and to stop the violations against the civilians in
هذا
Donbass,
ناهيك عن مسارعة تلك الدول
let alone those
إلى مد
countries'
أوكرانيا بالأسلحة
eagerness
الثقيلة والصواريخ
to supply Ukraine with heavy
وفتح باب
weaponry
التطوع
and missiles,
لمواطنيها للقتال في أوكرانيا
encouraging volunteers to fight
مما
in
يؤشر
Ukraine.
بوضوح إلى رغبة تلك
This
الدول
indicates the
في
clear-cut
الاستفزاز
desire
والتصعيد
of those
وليس في التهدئة
countries
والاحتواء.
for provocations and not for containment and
إن عرض
de-escalation.
مشروع القرار اليوم
This draft
يترافق مع
resolution
ضخ إعلامي مضلل هائل
coincides with huge
وحملات
media
كبيرة لتشويه الحقائق ونشر المعلومات الخاطئة.
campaign to spread erroneous information and
فهو
lies.
لم يصمم للبحث عن
It's
حل
not
حقيقي
designed to
للأزمة
find a clear-cut and real
وإنما
solution for the
لشيطنة
crisis,
الاتحاد الروسي وتشويه صورته.
rather to defame the Russian Federation.
إنه نص مليء بالثغرات
It is
وبعيد عن
a text
الموضوعية
that is full of loopholes
ويتجاهل الأسباب الحقيقية
and
الكامنة وراء
untruths.
إشعال
It
فتيل هذه
ignores
الأزمة.
the real reasons for the
السيد
escalation
الرئيس،
of tension and for the
إن
eruption
الذين
of hostilities.
يثيرون الحماسة اليوم بشأن الدفاع عن
Those
ميثاق الأمم
who
المتحدة
are eager to defend the Charter of
كان
the United
عليهم أن
Nations
يظهروا
now
نفس
today.
الحماسة
They should have
ضد
shown the
استمرار
same
إسرائيل باحتلال الأراضي العربية المحتلة
vis-à-vis Israel's continued occupation of
وضد
the
اعتداء
Arab
القوات
territories
التركية على سيادة
and
الأراضي
the
السورية.
aggression committed by the Turkish
وماذا
forces
عن انتهاك قوات
against
الولايات
our
المتحدة
territory? What about
الأمريكية
the US
بسيادة وسلامة
violations
الأراضي
of
السورية؟
the territorial integrity of our land,
سيدات
Syrian
والسادة،
territories?
إن رفض الجمهورية العربية السورية لسياسات الغرب في الهيمنة
rejection of Western
والتدخل في الشؤون
hegemonistic
الداخلية
policies
للدول الأعضاء
and interference in the internal affairs
وإشعال
of states,
وإطالة أمد الأزمات
prolongating
ونشر
crises,
الفوضى
promulgating and
وتكريس
spreading
الانتقائية
anarchy,
والازدواجية في المعايير
opting for double
وفرض الإجراءات
standards and
القسرية
selectivities, imposing unilateral
يحتم
sanctions,
عليها رفض مشروع
make
القرار
it
هذا
necessary for
والتصويت
us
ضده.
to reject this draft resolution
شكراً
and
سيد
vote
الرئيس.
against it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
لقد صوتت تونس لصالح القرار اليوم انتصارا لمقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة التي انبنت عليها سياستنا الخارجية وتأكيدا لحرص بلادنا على إنهاء الأزمة باستعمال الوسائل السلمية لفض النزاعات التي تبقى السبيل الوحيد والأمثل لوضع حد للتصعيد والحيلولة دون مزيد تدهور الأوضاع وتفاقم الأزمات والإنسانية.
Of the situation and further human tragedy. The world witnessed so many grueling wars destructive to peace and security and the life of people. Our experience indicates that military options cannot solve any crisis. Dialogue and negotiations can settle all differences and finding compromises. The current crisis in Ukraine comes at a time the world was getting out of COVID-19 and prepared itself for a new stage based on solidarity, cooperation, and effective engagement in multilateral action and achieving our common agenda. We believe that the world cannot undertake or cannot burden itself by further crises. We encouraged the engagement of the parties in peaceful negotiations and we urge the international community to intensify efforts to obligate these parties to resort to negotiations in a manner to cease hostilities and to prepare the way for finding permanent solution. Given the fact that international peace and security are a whole, Tunisia calls for dealing with all just questions in one standard so that peoples can regain their legitimate rights in accordance with international legitimacy to build a more stable, more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support the sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses serious concern with the extent of humanitarian devastation and peace and security challenges caused by the conflict. We are also concerned by the reports that Africans are being brutally segregated and denied safe exit and admission to neighboring countries. We call on all those who are involved to allow unhindered evacuation without looking at the color of origin of anyone. Mr. President, the founding principles of the United Nations Charter is to live peacefully with each other, uphold the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states while considering the security interests of other countries. Diplomatic options present the better solution to the sustainable peace. We call for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to the United Nations Charter and international order. The ongoing crisis poses a severe threat to international peace and security. We encourage concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to underline that a long-lasting solution to the current crisis primarily lands and is in the hands of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Dialogue is the only option to resolve the current crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Rwanda, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank
you, Mr. President.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
乌克兰局势
there continues to be dramatic changes of the situation in Ukraine. What is now unfolding is indeed heart-wrenching. China's basic position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and unequivocal. We always believe that all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected, and that international disputes should be resolved peacefully in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. The top priority right now is to ease the situation on the ground as much as possible and prevent the situation from escalating or even getting out of control. Russia and Ukraine have already held their first round of negotiations. Despite their differences, both sides have shown their willingness to continue the negotiations. China welcomes this. Faced with the highly complex and sensitive situation, China once again calls on the international community to stick to the overall direction of a political settlement and foster an enabling atmosphere and conditions for direct dialogue and negotiations between the parties concerned. Mr. President, any action taken by the United Nations and the relevant parties should give priority to regional peace and stability and the universal security of all parties, and should play a positive role for de-escalation and diplomatic solutions. Regrettably, the draft resolution submitted to this emergency special session for vote has not undergone full consultations with the whole membership, nor does it take into full consideration the history and the complexity of the current crisis. It does not highlight the importance of the principle of indivisible security or the urgency of promoting political settlement and stepping up diplomatic efforts. These are not in line with China's consistent position. Therefore, we had no choice but to abstain in the voting. Mr. President, the final settlement of the Ukraine crisis requires abandoning the Cold War mentality, abandoning the logic of ensuring one's own security at the expense of others' security, and abandoning the approach of seeking regional security by expanding military blocs. It is important to give full attention and respect to the legitimate security concerns of all countries, and on that basis, conduct negotiations to put in place a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism. Blindly exerting pressure and imposing sanctions and creating division and confrontation will only further complicate the situation, result in a rapid spillover of the negative impact of the crisis, and affect even more countries. We call on the international community to take a responsible approach, promote the relevant parties to immediately return to the track of political settlement, and seek a comprehensive solution to the Ukraine issue through dialogue and consultation. China is ready to continue its constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I give the floor to the distinguished representative, Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, the delegation of Sierra Leone has requested for the floor to explain its position on the agenda item and vote on the resolution. The government of Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the regrettable, serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. Sierra Leone also expresses serious concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, and particularly the safety and well-being of Sierra Leonean students in Ukraine. In appreciating efforts to provide the necessary safety and refuge, it is important for all those fleeing the conflict to be treated equally and with dignity, without discrimination, whether on the basis of race or status. A blanket denial is not the answer, nor representative of the values we seek to protect. Mr. President, Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles, and the purposes of the organization. Our vote today is not a selective application of our fundamental belief in the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, the territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. Our vote today is not to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. While we believe that the United Nations must be consistent in the application of its charter and in pursuit of its purposes, resorting to the threat or use of force and the violation of the territorial integrity of any member state inconsistent with the Charter must be rejected. Sierra Leone accordingly calls for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and in this regard, we welcome the commencement of ceasefire talks, and we urge for the continuation of the talks in a meaningful way. Finally, we also urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand has carefully considered the draft and voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that Thailand attaches to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and those of international law, in particular, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force against states. Our support of the resolution also underlines our deep concerns for the plight of affected civilians and the humanitarian consequences of the hostilities and violence in the area. In this regard, we call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential longer-term consequences on the rules-based international order and renew our call towards peace and for all parties to enhance dialogue through various means to truly realize a peaceful settlement of the situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we recognize the exceptional circumstances we are all facing, and we share the conviction that the General Assembly could not remain silent. The resolution adopted this morning conveys a message, and Brazil has added its voice to that of other members. The adoption of this resolution by the General Assembly shows the unwavering commitment of the international community to upholding the core principles upon which the UN is built. We are appreciative of the attention given in different paragraphs of the text to the critical need to monitor and alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the text for urging the parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee the safety of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, and to facilitate unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The resolution as adopted, however, does not go far enough in underscoring that the cessation of hostilities is only a first step to achieve peace. Sustainable peace needs additional steps. In this respect, it is regrettable that the supportive role of the United Nations, that the United Nations can and should play, has been left by the wayside in the eagerness to point fingers. Yes, the resolution is a call for peace by the international community, but peace requires more than the silence of guns and the withdrawal of troops. The path to peace requires comprehensive work on the security concerns of the parties. The only precondition should be an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, the resolution cannot be seen as permissive towards the indiscriminate application of sanctions and the deployment of arms. These initiatives are not conducive to the proper resumption of a constructive diplomatic dialogue and risk further escalating tensions with unpredictable consequences to the region and beyond. We also have concerns about preambular paragraph 15. It is not constructive at this moment fraught with danger in this particular resolution to comment on military measures adopted by any specific nuclear power, be it the Russian Federation or the members of NATO.
once effective negotiations do get started, all the parties must show true flexibility and spirit of compromise. Lasting solutions can only be achieved at the negotiating table through committed dialogue. Brazil continues to urge all actors to de-escalate and to renew efforts in favor of a negotiated diplomatic agreement between Ukraine and Russia that contributes to the establishment of the security and the stability of the region. We stand ready to resolutely work in favor of peace in the discussions in this Assembly, in the Security Council, and in other fora. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session comes as the conflict in Ukraine has reached a dangerous inflection point. The international community is alarmed by developments on the ground, and this is the clear message of today's resounding vote. The humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We have seen reports of rapidly growing civilian casualties and massive displacement, the extent of which Europe has not experienced in decades. The UAE is deeply concerned by these developments. Our collective responsibility must, however, be towards exhausting all efforts and using all diplomatic channels to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We remain firm in that belief more than ever before. Yesterday, the UAE pledged $5 million in response to the UN's humanitarian flash appeal. We know that in the days, weeks, and months ahead, more must be done. The credibility of this organization, born out of the ashes of World War II, rests on its universal representation and its effectiveness in applying the principles that we all uphold. However, as this conflict has revealed, the clear and full voice of the United Nations has only grown harder to summon because it is not equally applied. Despite deepening divisions, now is time to take a step back, identify diplomatic off-ramps, and engage constructively to end this conflict. It is also a time to summon our reserves of wisdom and experience to guide the way forward. Global solidarity means doing more than focusing on conflicts in some parts of the world while ignoring others. We need to shift our mindset from conflict management to conflict resolution. Our collective security depends on it. Let this crisis be the wake-up call. The future of this organization may rest on that. We all need to galvanize UN efforts to promote the dialogue, work towards an end to the hostilities, and address the humanitarian situation for those most desperately in need. The UAE recognizes the need to meet this moment with renewed diplomacy and leadership, and put the needs of the people on the ground at the center of our efforts. The avenues for dialogue must, however, remain open more urgently than ever before, and we must pursue them together. Mr. President, right now we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going. Resigning ourselves to a cycle of perpetual violence and sanctions that only adds to the suffering of civilians diminishes us all. We voted for this resolution, and we join with member states in making this appeal to peace, a just peace that endures by recognizing the legitimate concerns of all parties and also abides by the UN's charters of principles and independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. This resolution, however, as others have said, is not enough for a sustainable peace. Resolution of this conflict requires dialogue and effective diplomacy. This text represents the determination of member states to respond to the conflict today in Ukraine. That is the call that rings clearly from this meeting. We must now turn to finding ways to bring about its peaceful resolution with full respect for and commitment to real and engaged diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has been deeply concerned over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. An Indian national was tragically killed in Kharkiv yesterday due to the ongoing hostilities. We express our deepest condolences to his family and to that of each and every innocent civilian who has lost his or her life in this conflict. We demand safe and uninterrupted passage for all Indian nationals, including our students who are still stranded in Ukraine, particularly from Kharkiv and other cities in the conflict zones. Many member states share this concern. We have reiterated this demand to both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This remains our foremost priority. Ensuring the well-being and safety of our citizens is the basic duty of every government. We have therefore instituted special flights to bring back Indians home from conflict zones. My government has deployed senior ministers as special envoys to countries neighboring Ukraine to facilitate evacuation. We thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine for opening their borders and extending all facilities to our embassies at this time. India has already dispatched humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This includes medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. We are sending more such tranches in the coming days. India supports the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire. We also support safe humanitarian access to conflict zones. We remain firm in our conviction that differences can only be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has unequivocally conveyed this in his discussions with world leaders, including of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He underscored the urgent imperative for humanitarian access and movement of stranded civilians. We therefore sincerely hope that the second round of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine will lead to a positive outcome. India urges that all member states demonstrate their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Keeping in view the totality of the evolving situation, India decided to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت بلادي
Thank you, President.
لصالح القرار المتضمن في الوثيقة
We voted in favor
A/ES-11/L1 انطلاقا من إيمانها الثابت بمبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي لا سيما مبادئ حسن الجوار وحل النزاعات بالطرق السلمية واحترام السيادة والاستقلال والسلامة الإقليمية لجميع الدول. وتؤكد مملكة البحرين على دعمها لكافة الجهود الرامية إلى وقف العمليات العسكرية واللجوء إلى الحوار والوسائل الدبلوماسية. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
And use all diplomatic means necessary to achieve peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of vote after the vote on the draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. Eritrea firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected by everyone at all times for the attainment of sustainable world peace. Eritrea's vote is demonstration of its uncompromising stand for peace. Its position is against internationalizing, incessant rhetoric, and imposition of unilateral sanctions, which regrettably further polarize international relations and escalate the situation with enormous implications for civilians. Instead, we have consistently opted for world regions to be given the needed space and solidarity to address political problems. The situation between Russia and Ukraine raises serious concern with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. It requires immediate resolution by giving more chance to diplomacy. We hope that the ongoing talks between the two parties on the Belarusian border yields a quick and acceptable agreement to stop the war and pave a foundation for peace in the region. Eritrea opposes all forms of unilateral sanctions as illegal and counterproductive. Eritrea, the country that has been subjected to such measures by the West for 2 decades, including new sets of unilateral measures, understands that sanctions do not resolve problems of peace and security. On the contrary, they only hurt innocent people and undermine the road to peace. It will be remiss if I don't address disturbing reports that African citizens living in Ukraine are facing difficulties to cross the borders. We call on all countries to facilitate safe passage to people fleeing for safety regardless of their racial identity. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating that, that Eritrea would like to see that the windows for diplomacy remain open. We are confident of the ability of the parties to resolve their differences and reach an outcome that meets the interests and concern of all. We hope that the international community constructively supports the parties in their search for sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran is following the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine with grave concern. We reiterate our principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underline the need for full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. In order to find long-term and sustainable solutions to such crises, it is necessary to address their root causes. We note that the current complexities in the fragile region of Eastern Europe have been exacerbated by the provocative actions and decisions of the US and NATO. The security concerns of Russia must be respected. Wars and destructions inflicted on civilian lives and infrastructures are not acceptable, wherever they occur. The Islamic Republic of Iran calls for urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict. In this regard, Iran underlines the essentiality of dialogue to address issues of concerns to all sides, leading to long-term results. The UN must always avoid double standards, particularly when it's considering issues related to the maintenance of international peace and security. It is unfortunate to note that the UN, in particular the Security Council, has at times neglected this principle, which has undermined its credibility. A case in point is the Security Council's handling of the conflict in Yemen. Mr. President, we believe that the text of the resolution before the General Assembly lacks impartiality and realistic mechanisms for resolving the crisis through peaceful means. Furthermore, not all member states of the UN were given the opportunity to engage in negotiations on the text of the resolution. It should be emphasized that the General Assembly is not in a position to determine the existence of an act of aggression because, in addition to Article 39 of the Charter, GA Resolution 3314 of 14 December 1974 calls on the Security Council to determine the existence of an act of aggression. Moreover, convening the emergency special session based on the General Assembly Resolution 377A shall not be considered as the end of the dialogue. My government continues to call for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustained resolution to the current conflict, including an immediate ceasefire and a start of the dialogue as well as provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation abstained from voting on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
تود
مصر أن تؤكد على النقاط التالية اتصالا بالقرار الذي تم اعتماده للتو وصوتت مصر لصالحه انطلاقا من إيمانها الراسخ بقواعد القانون الدولي ومبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. واحد، إن البحث عن حل سياسي سريع لإنهاء الأزمة عبر الحوار وبالطرق السلمية ومن خلال دبلوماسية نشطة يجب أن يظل نصب أعيننا جميعا والهدف الأساسي للمجتمع الدولي بأسره في التعامل مع الأزمة الراهنة، ومن ثم يتعين إتاحة الحيز السياسي الكفيل بتحقيق ذلك الهدف الأساسي. 2. تؤكد مصر أنه لا ينبغي أن يتم غض الطرف عن بحث جذور ومسببات الأزمة الراهنة والتعامل معها بما يضمن نزع فتيل الأزمة وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار. 3. ترفض مصر منهج توظيف العقوبات الاقتصادية خارج إطار آليات النظام الدولي متعدد الأطراف من منطلق التجارب السابقة والتي كان لها آثارها الإنسانية السلبية البالغة وما أفضت إليه من تفاقم معاناة المدنيين طوال العقود الماضية. 4. من الواجب أن تتحلى كل الأطراف بالمسؤولية الواجبة لضمان تدفق المساعدات الإنسانية لكل محتاج دون أي تمييز، مع كفالة مرور المقيمين الأجانب بانسيابية عبر الحدود، حيث وردت بعض التقارير عن معاملات تمييزية. 5. تجدد مصر التحذير من مغبة الآثار الاقتصادية والاجتماعية للأزمة الراهنة على الاقتصاد العالمي برمته، والذي ما زال يعاني من تداعيات الجائحة، ولعل الاضطراب المتزايد في سلاسل الإمداد وحركة الطيران الدولي لأبلغ دليل على ذلك. 6. إن فاعلية ومصداقية قدرة آليات العمل الدولي متعدد الأطراف في مواجهة التحديات والأزمات المتلاحقة إنما يعتمد على تناول كافة الأزمات الدولية وفقا لمعايير واحدة وثابتة متسقة مع مبادئ الميثاق ومقاصده دون أن تمر عقود يتم خلالها تكريس الأمر الواقع والمعاناة الإنسانية.
Sufferings for decades, and thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to deliver the explanation of vote of my country, Algeria. في الوقت الذي يتابع فيه بلاد الجزائر وبقلق بالغ تطور الأوضاع الخطيرة الراهنة والمتصاعدة في أوكرانيا، يود وفد بلادي التأكيد مجدداً تمسك الجزائر الثابت بمبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة التي يتعين أن تبقى أساس القانون الدولي وحجر الزاوية في العلاقات الدولية، لا سيما تلك المتعلقة باحترام استقلال الدول وسيادتها وسلامة أراضيها طبقا للشرعية الدولية وحق الشعوب في تقرير مصيرها. وانطلاقا من مواقفها المبدئية فيما يتعلق بتعزيز النظام متعدد الأطراف والحفاظ عليه وتماشيا مع التزامها بتطوير العلاقات الودية بين الدول على أساس التعايش السلمي والتسوية السلمية للنزاعات والاحترام المتبادل للالتزامات الدولية والضمانات الأمنية، لا يمكن لبلاد الجزائر
my country,
إلا
Algeria,
الانضمام
can
إلى
only
كافة
join
الجهود
all the
والدعوات
other efforts
الدبلوماسية
and diplomatic
الهادفة إلى
calls
تخفيف
aiming
حدة
at
التوترات الحالية
de-escalating the current
وانتهاج فضائل
situation
الحوار
and
من أجل
adopting dialogue
إذكاء العيش
in
معا
order
في
to
سلام بين
foster
الدول
peaceful coexistence
حفاظا
among
على السلم
nations
والأمن
to safeguard
الدوليين.
international
Thank you,
peace
Mr.
and
President.
security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania has decided to abstain this resolution as a matter of principle and in defense of the UN Charter. Fundamentally, this decision resulted from our inability to amend or make reservations to some provisions in the resolution. We were convinced that there was a need to adjust the draft resolution. The United Republic of Tanzania believes that diplomacy is the best way to end this conflict. To this end, we appeal to all parties to the dispute to uphold human rights and their obligations under international law and humanitarian law, to de-escalate the conflict and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to take the floor to elaborate on South Africa's decision to abstain on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me reiterate our position expressed during the discussions of the emergency special session over the last few days. Firstly, by highlighting that South Africa remains deeply concerned by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and the regional and international socio-economic implications. We strongly urge all sides to uphold international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the conflict involves two members of the United Nations in an armed conflict, which this organization has at its foundation the responsibility to prevent. The United Nations, therefore, must take decisions and actions that will lead to a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace between the parties. The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contributing to a resolution of conflict. The resolution should have welcomed the commencement of negotiations between the parties. Additionally, the role of the Security Council, as well as the good offices of the UN Secretary General, could have been given more prominence in the resolution. It is understood that one of the root causes of conflict is related to the security concerns of the parties. This should have been addressed in the resolution. Even though this emergency special session of the General Assembly is being held after the failure of the Security Council to address the matter, we believe that the Security Council should still be urged to play its role as mandated by the Charter to maintain international peace and security. South Africa believes that the UN, especially in the context of emergency special sessions, whose nature and significance speak to the gravity of the issues we bring before the international community, should be used as a platform to build bridges, address the divergence of views, provide recommendation and support for the parties to engage with a spirit of compromise, while de-escalating tensions, committing to the cessation of hostilities, and building trust and confidence. Unfortunately, the text before us did not do that. South Africa will have also preferred an open and transparent process to negotiate the resolution today. This would have allowed all of us, as equal members of the Assembly, to present our views and ideally reach a level of understanding before the text was tabled. As member states of the organization committed to global peace and development, we must continue to work together to promote peace. Gestures that merely create the impression of promoting peace without meaningful action will not assist. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution because Lebanon, a founding member of the United Nations, believes in the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, especially the prohibition of the threat or use of force in international relations, the principle of non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, these are not merely slogans for Lebanon. We lived through invasions, occupation, intervention in Lebanon's internal affairs, and experienced devastation, loss, and pain that we are still enduring its consequences today. That's why our decision today was not taken lightly. We know what happens in wars, but we also know that wars happen not only when people fail to prevent them, but most importantly, when the voices of war drown the cries for peace. Lebanon, a peace-loving nation, enjoys a good relationship and friendships with all parties to this conflict, with Russia and Ukraine. And in this spirit, we call on everybody to go back to the logic of peace. Mr. President, yesterday, a European colleague told me he has never lived through war. I was happy for him. I lived through at least 2 invasions, a civil war, multiple assassinations, and explosions. That's why, Mr. President, I don't want anybody to live in what we lived through. It's time for diplomacy, for dialogue, and a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I hope that all my colleagues here in this GA hall will put the same energy and commitment that was put to make this vote and its result a reality, to start working for a peaceful resolution that takes both sides' concerns and interests into consideration, so the world will step away from this abyss of war. Mr. President, the preamble of the United Nations Charter tells us, quote, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. Now we need this unity. Unity for peace. The United Nations is well positioned to step up and step in to make this peace a reality. Now we need to stop the escalation in words and deeds and help both sides to take the path of peace for the sake, not only the 2 sides, but for the sake of our world. Mr. President, we in the Middle East are very concerned about this war because of its impact on Europe, but also because we know from experience what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. That the last 2 world wars left deep scars in our part of the world, obliterated countries and hopes, and we are still living its aftermath today. I hope, Mr. President, we all learn the lessons of the last wars, and I hope that from this moment we start working only for peace. Peace in our time, peace in all time, as a former president of the United States said. Mr. President, I agree with Albert Camus in his speech upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1957, that probably, and as a quote, every generation sees itself as charged with remaking the world. Mine, however, knows that it will not remake the world, but its task is perhaps even greater, for it consists in keeping the world from destroying itself. This is the same responsibility bestowed on us as the Charter instructed us to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, as a member of the family of nations, Malaysia is committed to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and the ideals it espouses. We reiterate the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security as well as global prosperity. All parties must uphold these fundamental and sacrosanct principles of the UN Charter and international law that guide the conduct of friendly relations between nations and peaceful coexistence. Many will agree that the resolution before us is far from perfect. While my delegation continues to have concerns with some of the language contained in the resolution, Malaysia voted in favor of it as a matter of principle and out of our strong conviction of the aforementioned principles. Mr. President, Malaysia values its strong and close relation with Ukraine and Russia. We believe the differences and legitimate security concerns of both parties, given the complex geopolitical context, must be addressed through dialogue and peaceful means in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and rule of law. In this context, we welcome the direct talks held between Russia and Ukraine in Belarus and urge both sides to continue on the peaceful path to prevent further loss of life and destruction. From the vivid discussion at this emergency special session, what stood out glaringly to us as was an overwhelming desire for the current conflict to be peacefully resolved. The General Assembly has spoken with a clear and fervent voice on the matter today. Now, more than ever, the Security Council has to live up to its primary responsibility as the custodian of international peace and security. Malaysia calls on the Security Council to spare no effort in resolving this conflict. Mr. President, the future of humanity is at a precipice. Humanity must prevail, and peace is the only answer. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my delegation is distressed by the ongoing violence and conflict in Ukraine. Conflict anywhere inflicts stress everywhere. Nepal is a peace-loving country, as its soil is consecrated by the birth of Lord Buddha, an apostle of peace. For us, values of peace, harmony, and peaceful coexistence are our way of life, so they are supremely precious. Norms of world peace, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression as enshrined in the UN Charter are the fundamentals of our foreign policy. The use of force against Ukraine goes contrary to these values and principles. Nepal opposes this violation of international law and the principles of UN Charter. Mr. President, there is no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue, to building peace and sustaining it. Nepal welcomes the second round of talk between Russia and Ukraine. We urge both sides to continue the dialogue with utmost sincerity and integrity to resolve this conflict peacefully and find a lasting political solution for their enduring peace and peace for the Europe. Based on Nepal's principled position on the inviolability of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of any state under international law, rules-based international order, and United Nations Charter, my delegation has voted yes on the draft resolution that was before us today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
طلبنا المشاركة في إبداء تعليل إعلان التصويت بعد التصويت.
We have requested the floor to justify our vote.
صوت العراق بالامتناع على القرار المعتمد أمامنا هذا اليوم
in this vote
والمرقم
on resolution A/ES-11/L1.
يأسف العراق لتدهور
Iraq
الأوضاع
regrets
والتوتر
the
الحاصل
deterioration of the situation and the escalating tensions between the Russian Federation and
ويدعو جميع
Ukraine.
الأطراف
And
إلى
Iraq
حل
calls upon
الأزمة
all parties to settle this
تغليب لغة
conflict
الحوار
by giving priority to
الوسائل
dialogue and
الدبلوماسية
through the diplomatic means.
والركون إلى طاولة المفاوضات
And we invite them to go back to negotiations in order to solve their concerns and in order to safeguard international peace and security
وعدم تعريض الدول إلى أزمات اقتصادية وأمنية
threaten the world with economic and political crises resulting from this situation. Iraq expresses its grave concern over the possibility for the terrorists of exploiting this crisis and the expected division in the international community. This would hinder the international efforts and our joint endeavors aiming at preventing terrorism and violent extremism.
إن تبني العراق لهذا الموقف
Iraq has decided to abstain
إنما جاء من الخلفية التاريخية
because of our historical background in Iraq
والمعاناة من الحروب المستمرة
and because of our
التي تعرضت لها الأجيال
resulting from the continuing wars against our
وبشكل مبدئي
Iraq, and in principle, does not support wars as a settlement mechanism. And we reiterate that all conflicts should be settled peacefully in order to safeguard the lives of civilians. Iraq calls upon all parties
بميثاق الأمم
to
المتحدة
uphold the
والقانون
UN
الدولي
Charter and international law
ويؤكد على ضرورة الحفاظ
and
على أمن
emphasizes
وسلامة
the
البعثات
necessity
الدبلوماسية
of safeguarding the
ومواطنينا في
security
ساحة
and
الصراع.
safety of the international
شكراً
staff and the
سيد الرئيس.
humanitarian workers. And thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr.
لقد صوت
President.
الأردن لصالح
Jordan
مشروع
has
القرار
voted
الذي
for
تم
the draft
اعتماده
resolution
الآن
that has been
تأكيدا
adopted
على
in order
سيادة الدول
to emphasize
وسلامتها
the sovereignty
الإقليمية
of states and
واستقلالها
their
السياسي
territorial integrity and political
وعلى محورية
independence. And
تحريم
because we
استخدام
believe
القوة في العلاقات
that force
الدولية
should not be used in
وبما
international
يخالف
relations
أحكام القانون
because it
الدولي
goes against the
وميثاق
provisions of
الأمم
international
المتحدة.
law and the UN Charter.
يأمل الأردن أن
Jordan
يتم العمل على
hopes
نزع
that
فتيل النزاع
we will be
والوصول إلى
de-escalating
حل
tensions in
سلمي
order to reach a
للأزمة
peaceful settlement of
وأن
this
يجلس
conflict
الأطراف مع
and that
بعضهم
both
على
parties will
طاولة
sit together
المفاوضات
on the negotiation
للوصول
table
لهذا
in
الحل
order to
السلمي
reach such a peaceful
ونأمل أن
settlement.
يتم
We
تكثيف
also
الجهود
hope that
الدولية
international efforts
السياسية
will be
والدبلوماسية
intensified on both the
لمساعدة
political and
الأطراف
diplomatic
على
levels
إنهاء
to
هذه
assist the
الأزمة
parties to end this
وبما
crisis
يجنب المنطقة
and in order
والعالم
to
الآثار
avoid
الجسيمة التي
the
نشأت
dire consequences
وستنشأ
that
عن
have
هذا
risen
النزاع
and could arise out of this conflict.
ونؤكد
And we would like
ضرورة
to
التزام جميع
reiterate that
الأطراف
all parties,
وأؤكد هنا جميع
and I
الأطراف
insist all
بأحكام
parties,
القانون الدولي
should
الإنساني
respect
وحقوق
the
الإنسان
international humanitarian
وقانون
law,
اللجوء
human rights,
الدولي
and the
ودون
international
تمييز.
refuge law without any discrimination.
وأخيرا
To
يود
conclude,
الأردن التأكيد
Jordan
على أهمية
would
احترام
like
أحكام
to
القانون
remind of the
الدولي
necessity of
وميثاق
respecting the
ومبادئ
international
الميثاق
provisions
في عدم
and the
الاعتداء
UN Charter,
وعدم
whereas
استخدام القوة ضد
use
الدول
should not
الأخرى
be, force should
وضد
not be used
الشعوب
against other countries
وضد
and
حق
peoples
تقرير
and
المصير
should not
وفق
be used
معيار
against the
واحد
right to
بغض
self-determination,
النظر
and
عن
that a single
المنطقة
standard should be
ودون
implemented
تمييز
regardless of the
في
region
تطبيق
concerned
المبادئ
and without any
والقواعد
discrimination in
الدولية
implementing international criteria and standards.
أن يؤدي
And we
ذلك
hope that
إلى
this
حوار
would lead
فاعل
to an effective
داخل المنظمة
dialogue inside the organization
لتنفيذ هذا النهج
in order to implement this approach
وتقييم النهج الحالي
and to assess the current approach
للوصول إلى هذا
and to
الهدف.
reach our common goal.
سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. We will now hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, last week the UN Security Council was prevented to act against Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression on Ukraine because of one isolated vote, that of the Russian Federation. Immediately after that, we initiated work to ensure that this body, where the countries of the world can all speak up, lives up to its responsibility. Over the past few days, the European Union has worked hand in hand with Ukraine and countries from all parts of the world to prepare the resolution just adopted. We thank all countries that have supported it. The decision is clear. The world has spoken. The Russian government must immediately stop the aggression, withdraw its troops, and abide by the rules of the UN Charter that applies to all equally. Over the past days, the brutality of Russia's invasion, with the complicity of Belarus, has reached unimaginable levels, with indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian cities causing death and destruction among civilians in complete disregard of international law. Distinguished colleagues and friends, this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just about Europe. This is about defending an international order based on rules we have all signed up to, the sovereign equality of all states, large and small. This is about whether we choose tanks and missiles or dialogue and diplomacy. Today's historic vote clearly shows Russia's isolation from the rest of the international community. By voting overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution, we have chosen to defend peace where Russia has chosen brutal aggression. We have chosen to defend this organization and its charter where Russia has violated the fundamentals of both. Russia stands increasingly alone. The European Union and the world stand with the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Mr. President, from all corners of the world we have come together to send a resounding yes to uphold international law and the UN Charter, a resounding yes to the principle of the sovereign equality of all UN member states, a resounding yes to the need to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of all UN member states, a resounding message to Ukraine and all Ukrainians. In the words of a colleague who spoke yesterday, you are not alone. We stand with you today, tomorrow, and until peace prevails and Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity are fully restored and respected. We have also sent a clear message to Russia and to Belarus. Stop the aggression now. Full stop. What you are doing is unacceptable. It is wrong. Your unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the core principles that you signed up to when you laid the foundation of this very organization, of this community of nations. Your invasion of Ukraine deserves our strongest condemnation. You will be held accountable, and every legal avenue available must and will be used to hold the aggressor to account. You must stop the war immediately. You must return your troops to Russia. You must return to the path of peace, of genuine dialogue. It is not too late to stop. It is not too late to reverse the course. It is not too late for you to return to this community where we believe, with all our faults and imperfections, in the principle of the sovereign equality of all. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the grave unfolding humanitarian crisis. We demand that all parties fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, and ensure the safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access and passage. Humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities, must be protected. Mr. President, thousands of civilians have been killed, more have been injured, and close to 1 million innocent civilians have been forced to flee across borders. Even more have been internally displaced inside Ukraine. They are in need of help and assistance, without delay, without hindrance and preconditions. And we take this opportunity to salute and express our deepest respect, appreciation and admiration for the generous assistance and protection that Ukraine's neighbors have shown to all those fleeing the conflict, men, women and children from all corners of the world. Once again, we conclude by echoing the words of a peaceful protester who had written on her sign, "If Russia stops fighting, there will be no more war. If Ukrainians stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine." I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this historic emergency special session of the General Assembly, a session that was called because the Security Council failed once again to fulfill its primary responsibility. A session that was convened due to the unjustified, illegal, and illegitimate act of aggression against a founding member of the United Nations by a permanent member of the very organ entrusted by the entire membership with preserving peace and security. A session that was held as a result of the use of veto power by the very member that's perpetrating the aggression. Mr. President, we are obliged to reiterate Russia's ongoing military offensive against Ukraine blatantly violates the fundamental rules of international law and the principles on which this august organization was founded. Rules and principles that aim to prevent wars and protect mankind from disastrous consequences. Consequences that we are unfortunately witnessing in and around Ukraine due to Russia's attacks. The international community could not have been as spectators to such an act of aggression. I am proud that as of today, it is not. With today's resolution, the United Nations emphasizes loud and clear that it stands against egregious violations of the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political unity of fellow member states. The membership is committed to preserving the letter and spirit of the fundamental constitutional document of our organization, the Charter. By adopting this resolution, the most democratic institution of the multilateral system denounces in the strongest possible terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We applaud the member states who contributed to the collective endeavor that culminated in today's outcome. You have stood firm in upholding full respect for the UN Charter and preserving the rules-based international order. We hope and trust that the calls and demands in this historic resolution will not fall on deaf ears. This body must follow through with its decision. Once again, we call on Russia to hear the demands of the global community and heed its own people's pleas to stop its military operations, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, reverse its decision regarding the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea, and return to diplomacy and dialogue without delay. We also reiterate our call for an immediate humanitarian pause. The peoples of the world hold their breath and wait with hope to see the march to the precipice halt. It is still not too late to go back to the negotiating table with serious engagement. Mr. President, as a neighbor and friend of both the Russian and the Ukrainian people, Turkey stands ready to facilitate the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. We still have 9 more countries member states who wish to speak. Therefore, we have heard the last speaker in statements after adoption. For this meeting, we shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon in this hall at 3 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.